Development at Oxford Department of International Development, and a Clarendon and Lincoln Kingsgate graduate scholar. His research interests include youth education, language, media, and youth in Delhi, focusing on the processes of preparation and identity formation, how these processes of preparation and identity formation shape ideas of mobility and aspiration. Thank you so much, Abhishek, for chairing this session. And I'd like to hand it over to you to start the session now on English language and education.
Thank you, Uma, for that very flattering introduction. So we have 4 panelists. 2 of them are joining us virtually. Our first presenter is Anwar Ahmed, who's presenting on Bengali linguistic nationalism, neoliberal English education, and the endangerment of indigenous languages in Bangladesh. Anwar is an assistant professor of language education as anti-oppressive transformation in multilingual settings in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. His current research focuses on critical language teaching and language teacher education from an affective perspective. So without further ado, let's hear from Anwar.
Thank you, Abhishek. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this session. Can you hear me properly? Because I'm in a context where the internet is not very strong. Can somebody tell me if you can hear me? Okay, thank you. So let me share my screen. Just give me 1 second. All right. So today I would like to talk about Bengali linguistic nationalism and the endangerment of indigenous languages in Bangladesh. So first of all, when Bangladesh started its journey as a nation state in 1971, there was a strong form of linguistic nationalism, obviously because of its history of struggle against the British colonial rule and also the Pakistani rule between 1947 and 1971. As you can see on this, on my slide here, so when the British colonial rule formally ended in 1947. As you probably know this, I don't have to repeat. So 2 states were created, India and Pakistan. And then the territory, which is known as Bangladesh now, was part of Pakistan, as like it was called East Pakistan. So as one of the provinces of Pakistan. And it was divided by, like geographically divided by India. And so the East Pakistan, which is again now Bangladesh, from the beginning actually wanted to be independent as a nation state. So after a long struggle, finally it got independent in 1971. So at the time there was this idea of one nation, one language. Not just in South Asia, but in Europe and other parts of the world. So this was the dominant ideology. So one nation means one, so a nation has to have one main language. And so Bangladesh was obviously influenced by that ideology. But also in order to decolonize its education system, its legal system, just to support this nation building project and at the same time decolonize culturally, linguistically. So it needed to have a strong form of linguistic nationalism. And so definitely the government wanted to promote that linguistic nationalism. And as you probably know, that the name of the country itself, Bangladesh, is very like language centric, because Bangla is the name of the language and Desh literally means country. So Bangladesh, so Bangla country. So it's a very close relationship between the language and national identity here. So what happened as one of the consequences of this linguistic nationalism was the marginalization of other languages. And so when we have the new constitution adopted in 1972 and the subsequent education policies of the country, there was, again, a strong support for the Bangla language as a medium of instruction in the national curriculum. However, this desire for a strong form of language-based national identity did not last long, because in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a strong push for English medium education. And this came mainly from the middle class of the country, the elite, and as well as the international organizations and donors such as the World Bank and IMF. And also there was another sector of education, which is called madrasa education, which is religious education, Islamic religious education, where the medium of instruction is Arabic. So as you can see on my slide, just if I try to give you an overview, so we have three sectors of education. You have public, like Bengali medium, private, English medium, and madrasa, Arabic medium. So as a result of these three dominant sectors of education and their medium of instruction, the indigenous languages of the country have been marginalized and minoritized. And in the 1990s, we saw a very, very strong push towards the neoliberal turn in education in general and in English language education in particular. As you see on my slide, there is a quote from two well-known applied linguists of the country. It's surprising to see how the policies in Bangladesh have shifted from this strong form of linguistic nationalism at the time of birth of the country, and then how quickly it turned towards these neoliberal forces and promoted English language education from grade 1 to up to the university. And my argument is that when people have been debating between the relative place of English and Bengali, so what should be the role of Bengali and English in the process of nation building? So, and what kind of educational policies should be promoted in order to preserve Bengali linguistic and cultural heritage, and at the same time promote English language so that the country can participate in the neoliberal globalization. A lot of debates and discussions about this topic, so English and Bengali. Nobody was really, seriously talking about the revitalization and preservation of indigenous languages. So in the second quote on my slide, you can see that this is like an example of that sort of thinking, that what should be the role of English, whether Bengali is threatened by the promotion of English language, etc. So in one of the, well-cited papers, Banu and Sussex said this, that, don't worry about it. Bengali language, the position and place of Bengali language is secure because it has enough speakers and there is a strong support from the government, etc. So do not worry about the future of Bengali. Well, but again, like nobody is talking about the future of indigenous languages of the country. And it is kind of ironic that a nation which used the linguistic sentiment of the people to fight the war of independence, because to preserve the rights, linguistic rights of the people, not only the people of Bangladesh, but all the peoples. And you probably know that these days we celebrate 21st of February as the International Mother Language Day. And that was an initiative by the government of Bangladesh to commemorate and celebrate and acknowledge the sacrifice of Bangladeshi people in 1952 in order to protect Bengali as a mother tongue. When the Pakistani government decided to introduce Urdu as the national language of the country, Bangladesh protested, and many people were killed on the February 21st in 1972. So in order to recognize that, and also to encourage people these days and governments and different organizations to preserve and promote all the languages of the world, we celebrate International Mother Language Day, and I think it was adopted by the UNESCO in 1999, if I'm not mistaken. So, as I said, I find it ironical that we, as a nation, we celebrate linguistic diversity and the people's rights to protect their mother tongue, and at the same time, the government and policymakers have not done enough to preserve and promote the indigenous languages of our own indigenous communities within the border of Bangladesh. Now, in the next slide, you can I give you just one example. If you are interested in knowing more about the situation of indigenous languages of the country and how they have been marginalized, there's a recent book chapter published this year by Shaila Sultana et al. On this topic of how indigenous ethnic languages have been basically invisibilized in the curriculum in the school. So here's the citation in the first point on my slide. And so based on my observation and readings of the literature, I have argued that policymakers have failed to imagine the indigenous people as equal citizens having the right to preserve their languages, cultural practices, and social identities. And when I make this argument, I agree with Elaine Scarry, who said that the way we act towards others is shaped by the way we imagine them. And I would like to add that this act of imagination, this act of imagining becomes more difficult when the other belongs to ethnocultural groups other than our own groups. So whenever somebody belongs to other group, then it becomes like extra difficult to imagine them as full human beings with rights and dignity. Now, at this point, I should also mention that there have been some responses from the government and policymakers towards the preservation of indigenous languages. So I'd like to acknowledge that. However, if you really take a close look at all these policy initiatives, one of the things you will see is that these initiatives to preserve and support indigenous languages have been largely influenced by the international influences, like international influences, like let's see, like donors, like who support different projects. And so so for this reason, there was a scholar named Paulson concluded that there was the motivations of the Bangladesh government to preserve and protect indigenous languages were extra linguistic in nature. So it's rather than really genuinely protecting the languages, the government and different initiatives wanted to respond to the external pressures from outside. So in order to reimagine the other through languages and places, I, again, agreeing with Scary, I wanted to propose these two initiatives. One is adopting a multilingual approach to education, and the second is creating territorial niche for preserving and promoting indigenous languages. Elaine Scary talked about 2 points. Again, her work was not based in English language education, but I borrow her ideas, and I think her ideas are equally relevant here. So she talked about cosmopolitan largesse and constitutional design, and I think both ideas are really important here. So we can promote cosmopolitan sensibility by introducing a multilingual approach to education, but in order to promote multilingualism, not as a medium, just like, and again, here by multilingualism, I do not mean just introducing multiple languages, but genuine dialogue between different ethno-linguistic groups and respecting each other, learning about each other. So the kind of multilingualism that I'm trying to promote in this paper will be effective only when we will have a geographical territory, like a legally protected space where certain languages will be prioritized over other languages. And again, what I mean is that in one particular geographical territory, if an indigenous language is the dominant language, the language of the majority of the people, that particular language should be treated as the L1, like first language in that area, and that language should be the medium of instruction in that particular area. And English and Bengali can be like a second language, a third language. So in that way, we can have the constitutional support to protect and promote languages. Otherwise, without this kind of constitutional support, it will be really difficult for the small minority languages to compete with English and Bengali and survive in this competitive linguistic marketplace. So I think I'm running out of time. I have 15 minutes, but I would be happy to have a dialogue and take your questions later on when we have the time. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Abhishek, I think I'm done here.
Learning experience. So Sajivani, when you're ready, you can start. And just some of the house rules. We have 15 minutes for each presenter. So once a presenter runs about 12 minutes of their time, I'll sort of interrupt and tell them to finish up in 3 minutes, if that's okay. All right, Sajivani, we can start.
Yes, thank you, Abhishek. Hi, everyone. My research topic is attitudes and practices of undergraduates in learning English as a second language in state universities in Sri Lanka. Background to the research study, commencing from the beginning of 1960s, Sri Lankan universities took some steps in teaching English as a second language, ESL, to the students who entered the universities. At the outset, English language was taught with limited purpose of giving students some ability to read and understand textbooks and other materials which were mainly available in English in the university libraries. Universities, by setting up and developing ELTUs, have taken much effort to teach English as a second language. Let's look at the problem statement. English as a second language, ESL, is taught in Sri Lankan universities for undergraduates. When the unemployment problem in Sri Lanka is analyzed, a percentage of newly graduated students have waited longer periods than other job aspirants to find employment, according to CBSL 2015. Most of the ELTUs in universities have positively responded to these new requirements and expansions. The students have negative attitudes towards learning English, and as a result, absenteeism in classes is high, showing weaker results. Major problem of this study is not obvious undergraduates' attitudes and practices with regard to learning English as a second language in universities. The researcher is expecting to determine the most significant factors influencing on students learning English, as it is not clear the factors influencing on students' English learning. You can see research objectives. The main objective is to find out undergraduates' attitudes and practices with regard to learning English, especially speaking skills, by following ELTUS classes, other facilities provided by state universities in Sri Lanka. As the sub-objective, in this study, the researcher will focus into identify classroom practices with regard to teaching speaking skills. These are the significance of my study. It will be more important for the university to develop the students' English learning and changing factors. It will be contributing not only to the universities, but also for the students as well. Some important literature reviews, as you can see here, Jamil and Zaidin, 2014. Although a certain group of students have positive attitudes to learn English, they hold negative attitudes of the current English language education curriculum offered in the universities, textbooks, and teaching methods. According to Ahamt in 2015, most of the students have negative feelings or fear regarding classroom instruction and teaching methodologies. As you can see here, Pushpanand in 2016, although undergraduates have positive attitudes towards learning English, in general, they have negative attitudes towards learning English within the university. This is the conceptual framework. All these factors are included in the democratic factors, but the researcher is concerning the practice of ESL speaking. Let's look at the sample size. You can see the sample size is 314 undergraduates. The population considered the first year and the second year undergraduates in science faculties. Undergraduates have been selected using convenience sampling. EL2 personnel have been selected using judgment sampling. 13 lecturers were taken for the interview. 16 classroom observation sessions have been taken. Let's look at the research methodology. Mixed method of inductive and deductive reasoning. It adopted multiple data collection instruments, including a questionnaire for students, classroom observations and interviews with selected lecturers to get a better perception and explain the quantitative results gained from the questionnaire, and also as a mechanism to triangulate data. This questionnaire is used as the main instrument to collect particular primary data. The questionnaire has been designed to insert both closed-ended and open-ended questions. Nominal, ordinal, and interval data have been used. Likert types questions have been included with the view of quantifying the qualitative aspect. Let's look at the data analysis. So this is the Cron-Batch alpha for the reliability analysis with regard to the variables, cognitive, behavioral, emotional, classroom practices, lecturers, peers, and ESL speaking. This is the endogenous or depending variables. All Cron-Batch alpha values are more than 0.6. There's the internal consistency is high. Internal consistency means the direction of these items. Because of high internal consistency, all these items can be combined to operationalize the correspondence variable. Let's see the factors effect on ESL speaking multiple regression model. Sub-objective have been addressed by using multiple regression model. This is the regression ANOVA results. Probability of test is statistics is 0.024. It is significant at 5%. Therefore, individual factors influence on students' ESL speaking. Durbin-Watson statistic is 2.001. This is between 1.5 and 2.5. Definitely, it is 2.0 mean it is seen that no serial correlation or residuals are independent. Therefore, regression model is more appropriate. The individual's beta values are being analyzed by these individual coefficients according to the significant values of p-values. Classroom practices is 0.003 with 0.267 beta values. The lecturer's parents' p-value is 0.005. It is significant at 5% with negative beta values, that is 0.214. Other factors are individually insignificant because the p-values are more than 5%. Therefore, cognitive, behavioral, and emotional, they influence jointly, not individually. So classroom practices and lectures influence individually as well. When classroom practices positively influence, lecturers, parents influence negatively at the moment in the universities. This is the Heteroskedastic Test. This is for the testing of the validity of regression model. For the standardized residual, standardized predictor value, there it's distributed randomly without having any predictable patterns. So therefore, the variation of residual is constant. It indicates that no heteroskedasticity problems in the residuals. Residuals are homoskedasticity. Therefore, model is high valid. This is the normality test of the residuals in the normal QQ plot. All these residuals are redistributed closely to the linear line. Therefore, residuals are normally distributed with zero mean. Therefore, model is more appropriate. This is the order of major influencing factor. When we see the order of all these factors, the first factor, feeling proud, studying English, which has influenced negatively on students. Second factor is English teacher speaks English in the class, which having a positive effect. The third factor is like English teacher not to use Sinhala in the class. second and third factors influence positively on ESL speaking of students. First factor has influenced negatively, as the type of characteristic cannot be developed among the students. It may be because the first year and second year students are having some extent aggressive. Those behaviors of the students cannot be changed because of their rebel behaviors. So researchers recommended the methods of lectures can be changed to develop ESL speaking of students in the university. So in conclusion, all these factors jointly influence on ESL speaking of students, classroom practices, as well as lecturers, they influence individually on ESL speaking. Classroom practices positively influence on speaking, but lecturers, parents influence negatively on ESL speaking of the students. Recommendation. A study of Sri Lankan State University undergraduates learning English as a second language found that they have positive attitudes towards learning English, but face challenges such as limited access to resources and opportunities for authentic language use. The traditional teacher-centered approach may also have inhibited their communication skills. Immense and communicative experiences should be promoted both inside and outside the classroom, along with student-centered methodologies and innovative teaching strategies to improve teaching language learning. So addressing these challenges is crucial for preparing students for future academic and professional endeavors. These are some of the list of references which I used. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sajivni, for that excellent presentation. We move on to our third presenter. Our third presenter is Shivani Nag, who will be presenting on From Access to Knowledge to Advancing Knowledge, a case for critical multilingual higher education space in India. Shivani is an assistant professor in the School of Education Studies in Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University in Delhi. Her research focuses on exclusion and experience and participation of the marginalized in school and higher education. Her writing and teaching focus on critical and feminist pedagogies, sociocultural theories of language learning and of cognition, linguistic human rights, and critical and interpretivist research methodologies. Shivani?
Thank you so much. So I hope this is right. So good afternoon, all of you. Okay, I hope I'm audible now. So what I will be presenting today is informed by engagement with theory with 10 years of teaching in university setups, where I've engaged with undergraduate, postgraduate, and doctoral level students. My own research work spanning over a decade, and also a lot of interactions with friends and comrades who've been first generation university goers in their family and who've navigated university spaces coming from non-English medium schooling trajectories. So all of that will hopefully inform what I share today. As I present, just a second. Okay. Yeah. I would also take just a moment to remember a very inspiring linguistic human rights activist whom we lost recently, who's been mentor and comrade for many years, and who's done significant work actually for linguistic human rights world over. So just a brief tribute to Toves Kutlub Kangas. My topic for today, which is, how do we look at universities? We've spent a lot of time thinking about access to knowledge, access to university systems, and in countries like India, which have recognized that different kinds of disadvantages and marginalities, oppressions have existed, that have worked as gatekeepers for many from entering into universities, we do find a lot of affirmative policies, affirmative action policies to see that the ones who were historically kept outside the domains of university find an entry space. But are university spaces only about accessing what has already been legitimized as the body of knowledge, right? These are some quotes by Dollar and Pinkard, which reflect the imagination of one of the key modern universities of our time, the Humboldt University. Where university was imagined not just as a space where somebody would come and get an access to a linear transmission of knowledge, but would participate in advancing knowledge, would be keenly interested in advancing ideas. So university was imagined as a space of ideas and not just as training of professionals. I mean, that was not really imagined to be a key goal of the university. So if I could just briefly read out one part, of Humboldt's vision of the university was not to be a training ground for the professions. It was an incubator for self-determining men of taste and learning who would emerge as the proper leaders and state officials of a modern free form of life. Right? In another excerpt from Dollard, the first key feature of such model was that knowledge was an in itself. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge, relying on its own authority, and therefore the transmission of knowledge was to be intimately linked with research. So if, with this imagination of university, one also realizes that, while it's a beautiful imagination of a place where we all will engage with ideas and work with each other, collaborate, discuss, and see how those ideas advance. There is a reason why, these spaces also then became, quote unquote, the ivory towers. And I do realize the irony of saying that from a podium in Oxford. Just quoting Dollar here, knowledge for the sake of knowledge, which seemed to yield an academic sphere cut off from the quickly changing modern world, a sphere closed in itself, distant from the interests and the antagonisms of the buzzing social reality. The catchword was the ivory tower. And what I intend to do in the next few minutes is to examine the role of language in becoming that gatekeeper. A gatekeeper in determining access to knowledge, and also a gatekeeper in determining who gets to advance knowledge, who gets to theorize. And here I'm reminded of a quote by Bell Hooks, one that I immensely identify with. As a Black feminist scholar, her entry point into university spaces and into the world of ideas is also because, as she says, I came to theory because I was hurting. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory then a location for healing, which I do feel would resonate with many from the marginalized who endeavor and dream to making into university spaces. Coming to the question of language as gatekeeper for accessing knowledge, and here I'm sharing the context of India. Now the landscape of education in India is such that when we look at school education, English as a medium of instruction is used in 12.98% of schools at the primary stage, 18.25 at the upper primary stage, 25.84 at the secondary stage, and 33.59 at higher secondary stage, right? So it's less than 50% of schooling that is happening in English medium instruction. However, the scenario completely changes the moment you make a transition to the university, where majority of the central universities in India have English as their medium of instruction unless until the course that is being offered is a language course in the first place, right? And even most of the state universities are English medium, or some at most maybe bilingual, right? Now the problem is not the fact that the earlier education is happening in English. There are a lot of theorists, and especially the work done by Vygotsky and Rojoff, Brunner, and other social learning cultural theorists emphasize how important teaching in mother tongue is for conceptual foundation of children. So when I point this out, that there is the landscape of language changes as we make the transition from school to university. The problem is not that the earlier years of learning are happening in the mother tongue. The problem is, one, of course, that in university, the space for the other languages completely disappear. And second, when we look at schooling in India, it's also important to realize that the schooling system in India is a very unequal schooling system. The divide is not just between the private and the public, or the English medium and the regional medium schools. It's an interesting pattern, right? So amongst the private, you have high cost English medium schools. Most of the private education is in English medium. So you have the high cost fee private education institutions, you have the low fee charging English medium, and even in public schooling, which is the government funded, you have a very hierarchized and divided schooling system, right? So you have the Kendriya Vidyalayas and the Navodaya Vidyalayas, which are infrastructurally better off than many of the other Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan schools or the MCD schools, which are not as resource intensive, right? So you see deep hierarchies both within the private and the public. And hence, most of the quote-unquote good quality education is happening in schools which either have English as the medium of instruction or are bilingual. Most students coming from marginalized sections, right, who cannot afford education. I mean, in India, we do recognize right to education, but we recognize right to education in the most resource-starved public schools. Even the better off schools, which are funded by the state, like the Kendriya Vidyalayas, do not fall under the ambit of right to education, right? So the marginalized have access to the most resource-starved schools, which of course are not English medium. And the problem, like I said, is not that they are not English medium. Many, including one of the interesting works by Shalini Advani brings out, what language classrooms of these schools are like. So the problem with these schools is not that English is not the medium of instruction or that it's brought in late, but the language pedagogy is severely lacking. In many of the low-fee private schools and in government schools in far-flung areas, in remote areas, in tribal areas, you have teachers. A whole lot of school system actually relies on shiksha mits or mitras, voluntary teachers who are not properly trained. They are not informed, but their teaching of English is not informed by a sound pedagogy of English. So in many schools, you will find that the English classroom doesn't look very different from an EVS classroom. The teacher reads out the text, translates the text, and the students, because they don't have exposure to English, are only forced to rote memorize. So there is really no metacognitive skill, that is being enabled in these schools. So this is the landscape that students coming from disadvantaged sections have to navigate before they enter the university spaces. So they don't enter university spaces with schools having equalized the existing differences. You see that schools have only sharpened the divides that were already existing. There are some interesting data. This is the National Crime Record Bureau data, where 10,159 students in India died by suicide in 2018. A massive increase. And many researchers show that these suicide rates are significantly higher for students coming from oppressed castes and class. In India, after a spate of suicides in one of the premier institutions, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, a Thorat committee a committee under Professor S.K. Thorat was constituted. And amongst the many findings, one was that since language of learning and communication is English, poor language skills are a great disadvantage. AIMS has not taken any initiative to assist the SC/ST students to improve their language skill and their knowledge in basic subjects so that they could catch up with courses which are fairly advanced. Right? So one can see that students with cognitive skills enter higher university, but the kind of English which is needed for academic purposes is very different from what we might need for our conversations. Many universities did respond to these challenges by starting some English remedial programs, English support programs in universities, but most of them focused on very basic conversational English, which is very different from academic skills, from academic English that is needed to write, to cogently present an idea, to synthesize and compare different texts, to be able to write a reflective piece, analytic piece. In my 10 years of teaching, a lot of students who come from the kind of schooling system we have in India, they often share that, for 14 years, they're told to write from the text. They have to rote memorize and write from the text. And within a fortnight, they're told that that amounts to plagiarism. There is really no training for engaging with complex academic text, what it means to, present an argument. And so that is the question so that's the concern when it comes to accessing knowledge. We also know that language is not just a tool for transmission. It's an active, potent cultural tool. Works of Bakhtin, Foucault, many other philosophers will help us understand that better. And here you have a lot of scholars in India, Uma Chakravarti, Gopal Guru, Sharmila Rege, pointing out that how language is being used to serve as a gatekeeper, stopping students coming from marginalized castes and classes to also engage in theorizing. Right? Just sharing one quote, the high priest in theory seeks to canonize the social science discourse around ground rules that are often inhibiting, protocols that are discouraging, language that is definitely frightening. The creation of language becomes another effective weapon to restrict the entry of Dalits into academic circles that are based on a particular syntax, mostly Anglo-American. And different scholars have used terms like epistemological patronage, epistemological imperialism to reflect this. Largely, so we do see a new education policy in India, which does talk about a multilingual higher education space. But it's also important to read between the lines. I'm just sharing one excerpt from the NEP, the National Education Policy 2020, that says, India's languages are among the richest, most scientific, most beautiful, and most expressive in the world, with a huge body of ancient as well as modern literature, film and music written in these languages. Now, one concern is, it almost reads like Macaulay Part 2. If we were to use Indian languages or advance them or use them extensively only because we think they have a great scientific nature and most beautiful, and no one knows what those criteria are, right? Who determines those criteria? Then this means that there will be a different kind of language hegemony which will replace the hegemony of English. And many authors have already pointed out the problems of standardized regional languages, which happen to be highly Sanskritized and hence very far off from the experiences of those who are coming from marginalized backgrounds, especially if one looks at gender and caste. Right? So standardization is a huge problem that needs to be thought about even when we are engaging with language question in India. So of course, so I'll just end with this, that the concerns that emanate from imposing of English and higher education and the attempts to standardize languages and homogenize meanings requires an urgent and rigorous debate. as the same have serious implications on democratization of knowledge, access, and production. A key aim of critical pedagogy is transformation of reality, and the transformation necessarily requires identifying and naming. So to force all education in English, all theorizing in English is extremely silencing. There are certain questions which come from experience that cannot be nuancedly articulated in English. A lot of theories we engage with are translations in English. They were not originally written in English, at least that's true for social sciences. So there does appear to be an urgent need in higher education to challenge this hegemony and create space for a richer multicultural and multilingual academic discourse that imagines languages as fluid, and that is able to move away from the idea of a very standardized, non-fluid, non-permeable language. Thank you so much for your patient hearing.
I'm so sorry, Shivani, we ran out of time, but I think in the Q&As, we'll take up some of the questions there. Our next presenter is Saurabh Goswami, who will be presenting on multilingualism and globalization in remote trans-Himalayan India. How does place identity affect language learning? Saurabh is a PhD candidate in applied linguistics at Georgetown University, Washington, DC. His areas of research are critical multilingual studies, multilingualism studies, and critical language policy. He explores institutional and multilingual discourses and identity work, especially through discourse analytical approaches. Saurabh is interested in dialectalism, and identity in Northeastern India, early career students, and multilingual queer communities. Saurabh?
Great. Thank you, Abhishek, for that excellent introduction, and Mohini and Uma and everybody else here for inviting me to speak with you. Also, thank you, Shivani. I think very important points were raised about languages, episteme, and also identity work, and the importance of thinking of language as osmotic rather than being these compartmentalized things, right? I am here to share with you about place identity and what it has to do with language learning. So very quickly, what is the study about? Very broadly, this study is about how multilingual language learning is unfolding for adult learners of L3 English, or English as a third language in India. More specifically, I will share with you how I think it modulates and is modulated by the geophysical and the geopolitical variable that we all understand as remoteness. And finally, the study will also ask how these two variables, language acquisition and learning, and remoteness, transact with larger things such as globalization, industry, particularly tourism, and identity work today. And I'm hoping the findings of the study will contribute to an important topic in applied linguistics, which is, do materially situated, localized pedagogies of teaching languages work? Is it worth our while to involve many languages in the classroom? That sort of thing. The study site is a 12-month graduate program in entrepreneurial leadership for the Himalayan region, which I will call Entrepreneurs for the Himalayas, or EFH for short. It is in the context of a series of writing classes that were offered over 6 months in 2021. These classes were led by two facilitators. I was not one of them, but I have been part of EFH from the day of its founding back in 2017. A little more about EFH and where it's located. EFH is located in the territory of Leh Ladakh at 11,480 feet, so dizzying heights. Geologists would call it a high altitude cold desert. Symptoms of acute mountain sickness are very frequently reported there, bordering Tibet and Pakistan, there's a very heavy Indian national defense presence. It has, since colonial times, it's been orientalized as this eternal Shangri-La, away from the sweep of modernity. In 1974, we opened up to tourism, which added to the economy, but also caused a lot of cultural sort of anxiety. Since the early 2000s, it's been commodified increasingly as a spiritual tourism destination with Buddhism as the USP. There is a significant population of Ladakhi Muslims, particularly in adjoining districts such as Kargil, but they've more or less been ignored. In February 2023, Leh Ladakh was given the status of a union territory of India, which was a political autonomy that was initially welcomed. But at the time of writing this paper, demonstrations for statehood and land and job reservations for indigenous Ladakhi people had sort of broken out on the streets of Leh. A few other things, seasonal isolation. So from October through March, you cannot get to Ladakh by road because of extremely heavy snowfall. Uncontrolled urbanization in sort of fallow areas as well as areas in downtown Leh, and severe scarcity of water resources and therefore endangerment of already critically endangered wildlife species, etc. Another important thing that I want to also share with you is that given the very strong, powerful Buddhist orthodoxy in Leh Ladakh, people look at sort of the environment and what's happening to the environment from the perspective of Vajrayana, which looks at the world around us, the mountains, the streams, the rivers, the poplar trees, the snow, the glaciers, the snow leopard, etc., as agentive and sentient, right? And there are many prescriptions that are made also to get around the sort of threats of human activity. So what is this site then? It is a high altitude region, extremely challenging climate, but it is also a very busy tourist destination. It's pretty close to Delhi, for example, in Chandigarh. So there are these conflicting features in what the United Nations calls the remoteness index, right? That more or less is the background. I draw from a variety of literatures, as you can see on the screen. I will not go through all of them, but primarily how English language learning has been impacted by tourism economies, discourse of commodification, etc. I also draw very heavily from the concepts of remoteness, place, a sense of place rather than space, and also what is called topophilia, which is an affective attachment to the physical environment around you. I asked two research questions in my project. How do the participants of the study speak about geographical place, so the geospatial location that they're in, as they learn their languages? And second, what role do English and the other languages have in their lives? Very simple stuff. I conducted 4 semi-structured interviews with 4 participants, which I recruited from convenience sample, simply because they were very easy for me to reach. And I knew the 2 instructors who are working at EFH right now. I had met these 4 participants in person only once, and then the COVID pandemic happened, and we fell out of touch. So when I got back in touch with them, we had to naturally sort of navigate these geospatial, emotional, and psychological fissures that the pandemic had caused for us. 4 participants, Jostar, Dolkar, Zasal, and Dorje, in their mid to late 20s, 2 self-identified as male and 2 self-identified as female. You can see some of them are trekking guides, high altitude trekking guides, mountaineers. Others are entrepreneurs doing a variety of things with textiles, carpets, beautiful work. Dorji is a farmer, Zasal is also a student. They speak a variety of languages, different dialects of Ladakhi, which are the Sino-Tibetan languages, which has already been identified as threatened. But they also speak Hindi, English, and some are learning French, some are learning Korean for different reasons. It's also important to clarify that Ladakhi is a heavily diglossic language. There is High Ladakhi and Low Ladakhi. Colloquial Ladakhi is spoken, but you cannot read Ladakhi unless you're trained in classical Tibetan. That's also a complication. Findings, I present to you only 3 findings because there's 8, and I've distilled 3. One, remoteness was constructed very directly by the participants, not by myself, but by them as an assessment of several features, so climactic features. So they say things like the sun is very strong, there's no moisture. Community behavior, people don't use sunglasses, they don't know about ultraviolet radiation. Access to public goods, such as there are no good facilities, there are no hospitals, there's just one. Access to telecommunications and education and technological modernity. Yeah. There were also symbols of high altitude industry that were language. People spoke about solar power, Bali in particular, tourism, and how space is registered subjectively. And very, very interestingly, and this is my favorite finding here, was that the participants were calendaring their language learning according to seasons. And I see this as a necessity as well as an affordance of high altitude remoteness. So you see, Dorji says, my target would be tourists. He's, he has this project that involves making dry soup products for tourists. And he knows that they need Bali's energy. Bali is extremely important. Bali has been thought of as a symbol of high altitude agriculture in other studies. And Dorje must speak about its cultural relevance to his customers. And English is extremely important for him because in his profession as a farmer and entrepreneur working in these fields, at EFH, he would benefit from learning how to language Bali, the material conditions of its agriculture, the production, its connection to climate and altitude, its symbolism for the Ladakhi people. Therefore, Dorji wants to learn English because he wants to be able to confidently market Bali to tourists, to travelers, to mountaineers as this time-tested, genuine, authentic Ladakhi brain. Right? So English is connected to his work as a high-altitude farmer and you can also see Zaksal says that she regrets forgetting Bhoti, and Bhoti is also another word for Ladakhi. But she needs to learn English. And Chostar says, you know what I'm going to do in the winter? I'm going to learn Bhoti. Dorji also wants to learn French because several of his clientele are from French-speaking countries. But everything happens in the winter. Remember those 6 months of isolation? Language learning happens then. Another thing that I found was that everyone spoke very clearly in a binary idiom of insider-outsider. This has been problematized. I don't have the time to problematize it right now, but maybe later on. I think an important thing to clarify also that I have also always been seen as an outsider. We call them Gyagarpa. Gyagarpa is a word that really just means a plains dwelling people. Right. So here Dolkar says about her colleagues at EFH, some outsiders find Ladakh very boring. People coming from different parts of India. They say, oh, this mountain has been like this for an entire year. Nothing's happening. I'm getting bored of it. And some Ladakhis would get offended and they'd say, how can you say this? This mountain is so beautiful. In the winter, it is covered with snow, and in the summer, it looks like this, and in the spring, it looks like that. So you can see that Dolkar looks at the fixity of the mountain as a beautiful thing, right? Altitude and sunlight, it's doing these beautiful things on the mountain. So there is this concept called Rangjon, which means self-making in nature, of Ladakh's topography, which is an important factor of Dolkar's life and language. She constructs Ladakh as a place out of such elements such as these distinctive colors, textural, visual qualities in the environment, etc., which Duan speaks about when he defines topophilia. English, therefore, gives these students, both Ladakhi and non-Ladakhi, access to one another's subjective registration of space. Language is a tool in daily life as well. We saw that each of these languages has a separate epistemic potential, right? So English is seen as a linguistic capital for building relationships with your clientele. Language brokering happens through French because Dorje is also working with a group of doctors from médecins sans frontières. So he brokers French, and Dolkar has been learning Korean because she's extremely interested here. Everyone laments the attrition of Bodhi and a Buddhist theodicy and the need for translation and writing. As you can see here, Dolkar says, now I only see Tibetan and Ladakhi in the scriptures, sometimes in the news. That is also so rare. Right? So, strong visceral feelings about place, about the geophysical, psychological location of the learners. Remoteness is an ethno-linguistic construct. It really isn't this fixed thing. It determines what languages are chosen, what are necessitated for learning, and what is said in those languages about remoteness, about place, about belonging. The multilingualism of the participants, so languages of global capitals such as English and French, as well as Bodhi and Tibetan, Ladakhi and Hindi, etc., tied to circulations of global capitals, specifically through tourism. And everyone is mobilizing their linguistic repertoires to navigate this economy, to exert a climate politics, to build their own identities as Ladakhis living in Ladakh. And these negotiations with globalization and tourism are what I think are peculiarly Ladakhi imaginaries of late modernity. One last thing, commodification and territorialization of Leh Ladakh as a tourist destination. All four of them participate in it and also resist it. Very, very quickly about this conclusion, I think that the Ladakhi professionals considered here strategically exert their English literacy and their multilingual repertoires to control their relationships place with tourism industry, with the local and the global. Sometimes specific, often contrarian impulses appear to drive their language choices and generate different streams of modernity in Ladakh. I think that's also extremely important. I think, and I hope that this study is going to help us think of coming up with pedagogies which are more localized. A large part of the study that I left out was what they directly said about the pedagogy at EFH, which was very, very localized and multimodal, involving materials found around the classroom. But I will wrap up for now. Thank you so much for your patience.
Okay, no, this.
I'm just getting unmuted.
Thank you, sorry for that excellent presentation. I was just taking down some notes. I'll briefly go over what I feel connects all the sort of presentations that we've heard. They sort of specifically focus on various aspects of English language, which plays this dominating role that we're aware of. But I think there are many facets that were explored in these four presentations. So, I mean, the first thing that comes up is, of course, the dominance of English and the question of language mediums. Because it's not just the relationship with power, prestige, and aspirations of mobility, but as we see, all South Asian states have a kind of linguistic market, and English often competes with other languages. And the sort of that varying effects of it, for instance, in India, there's a competition between English and Hindi, which often comes at the cost of other languages. I think Anwar's presentation about what happens to the indigenous languages of Bangladesh beyond Bangla sort of highlight what sort of effects this kind of competition has. Because some languages like Bangla in Bangladesh or Hindi in India are secure, but other languages are often not. So this not only leads to sort of further minoritization of already marginalized languages, but also shapes dramatically different values and outcomes associated with such linguistically segregated education, as we see in Shivani's presentation, and where she says, I think, which is a very interesting point, that the marginalized can only be empirical and never really get to theorize their own positions as marginal, which I think is the kind of epistemological violence, one would argue, that is a huge sort of barrier, even though education is seen as this sort of equalizer, as an avenue to mobility. How language restricts those very mobilities is a very, very sort of important point. The other sort of overarching theme that I think runs through these presentations is the intimate relationship between language and identity. But to this, I'd probably add that there's a connection between the English language in South Asia and ideas of not just modernity, but citizenship. So when one says that, as in Anwar's presentation, for instance, when he argues that the indigenous people are not conceived, not imagined as full citizens or equal citizens, and how that is linguistically indexed, that I think is a question that we all face in all of the South Asian contexts. And Saurav's presentation highlights the role of place in the kind of multilingual negotiations that go on, for instance, in Ladakh, and how that shapes a particular identity, in this case, an identity of belonging to a remote Himalayan region, but in other contexts, belong to either sort of cosmopolitan areas or to other parts. And what the politics of that is, I think, is the question that I would sort of encourage all the presenters to think about, that what does it do to their participation, their sort of participation as full citizens, as equal citizens, especially given that a lot of the presentation covered people, communities who are variously marginalized in the nation states that they find themselves. Specifically, I think the questions that I have, and then we'll open to questions from the audience members. For Anwar's presentation, I believe Anwar couldn't cover this in his presentation, but in the paper, Anwar sort of recommends a sort of to encourage indigenous languages to sort of have certain geographical areas demarcated for a particular language to be taught, and sort of be considered important in that particular language. And I sort of want to ask if that is indeed the best solution, given that it also is very similar to India's linguistic states, and the idea behind India's linguistic states to have a state, a geographical area for a particular language. But as we see in the Indian example, many languages are still minoritized within these divisions. So how can we sort of keep making these divisions? Because sometimes creating these geographical areas is what minoritizes certain languages. So how would one sort of combat that? For Sanjeevani, I think, I mean, that's an excellent sort of overview of how undergraduates feel and what the correlations are when they're sort of when they learn English in state universities. But I wonder if you could sort of push this idea of positive attitude and negative attitude, and sort of delve a little deeper into it. Because when you say that they have positive attitudes about learning English in general, but then when they come to the universities and go through the particular training programs, they have a certain negative attitude towards that. I wonder what what was the positive attitude that they had in general? What ideas sort of motivated them? And what was the reality? Was it connected to the outcomes that they experienced in these training programs? So if you could go a little into that, and also the interviews with the teachers. I would love to hear more about what were their reflections on these attitudes among undergraduate students. Shivani, I mean, that was an excellent sort of, I mean, it's a problem that we all identify. So I just want to ask if, how does one sort of break the dominance of English in, academia? For instance, we are sort of sitting here speaking in English, and this kind of epistemic violence that is engendered in this. How does one move beyond that and yet sort of not fall into the particularly right-wing nativist sort of ideology that we see, for instance, in Hindutva in India? Because there is a promotion of Sanskrit and Sanskrit learning or Hindi learning for that, but we all know that that is not really trying to be inclusive, but that's just trying to prop up another language for further forms of inequality. So how does one sort of navigate this very difficult terrain? And sort of, I mean, that's fascinating. And the pictures, I think, were, reminded us of the hills, and we all want to go there. But what I was curious to learn about was that you said that they also learn Hindi. And I understand that there's this insider-outsider thing with English seen as a way to connect with the outside world, English and other foreign languages, and this sort of almost nostalgia, correct me if I'm wrong, for the native language, which they also regret losing, or at least believe that should be preserved. So where does Hindi fit into this? Because especially in the Indian context, there's always a three-language negotiation that happens, at least three language. So I wonder where Hindi fits in, what is the role of it? Because Ladakh is one of those places where Hindi would also be seen as a sort of neo-colonial language. So what kind of currency was associated with it? And were there sort of any affective ties to the language? And the other thing, I mean, which is fascinating and I would love to learn more about, is in sort of representing the local landscape and life and communicating that to tourists, what kind of translations happen? Because a lot of them, as you said, don't actually speak their native language. So in which case, where is this? Because it sounds like a case of translation, but clearly there's a lot that is both subtracted and added in that. So how does this really work? And how much is it impacted by the outside world, by the sort of lexicon of tourism that they learn from the outside? Right. So those are my, sorry, I've gone on for too long. But yeah, those are my observations. Should we take questions and then? Okay. Yeah. Right. So Anwar, if we could start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Abhishek, and everyone else here. Very interesting presentations. So to your question, Abhishek, I think the problem that I have raised in my paper is very hard to find a solution to this problem. I want to recognize that. I think one of the major problems here is that when you have multiple languages in a space, conflict is inevitable because the languages have the same purpose: communication, cultural identity formation, and all the indexability of ethnocultural identity. So multiple languages serve the same purpose, basically. So if you think about any other objects or ideas, they have different purposes. So like the chair and the television and the computer screen, they don't necessarily conflict with each other in this room because they have different purposes, different functions. But when you have multiple languages, they have similar purposes. So the conflict is inevitable. So I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I don't think that there is an easy solution to this problem of the kind of multilingualism that I would like to promote, because of the complexity of this space and language, and with people's mobility, like from different parts of the country and the world as well. So now the way I'm trying to conceptualize this kind of multilingualism in order to preserve and promote the indigenous languages is, again, it is difficult, contested, but I think if we can have just like the government support to identify the dominant language, let's say the main language of a region, and then having that language as the primary medium of instruction in, let's say, the elementary schools or high schools in that area. And the parents will have a choice where they want to have a different language as the medium of instruction for the children. So this is not an easy solution. But the reason I'm promoting this idea is that we need a geographical, like a territorial niche for a language to promote, just similar to, let's say, when we have protected fishing area, like we have to intervene, because if we like we means like the government, the people with power, they need to intervene. Otherwise, the minority languages will not compete with other dominant languages. So right now, I think the way we are promoting multilingualism in many parts of the world is following the logic of free market economy. So, okay, so all languages are there and there will be competition, and then parents and stakeholders can choose. So let them compete. So that's the logic. So like anything else. But I don't think this way of promoting multilingualism will be helpful, and it will save the weak languages and their communities. So it will not be equity-based. So the kind of equity-based multilingualism I would like to see is that will be supported by government intervention, where the territorial niche, there will be certain territorial niches for certain languages. And the same language could be a first language in one area and a second language in another area, depending on the number of speakers of that language. So that's how I have been thinking about. But again, I recognize this is going to be difficult and challenging.
No, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there are any easy solutions for this, but thank you so much. If the other presenters could sort of briefly respond to my comments, because then we can also move on to questions from the audience. So Sajivani, would you go next?
Yes, as for the first question you raised from me, why is this the negative attitudes towards this learning English in the university? Once they have finished their higher education as well as advanced level education, once they come to university, the only hope is to get the degree. They don't, think of English language. Of course, when it comes to the final, especially in the science faculty, in the 5th year only, the students remember that they need English. Like when it comes to a job, like without written or oral communication, like when they don't have that, getting a job is very difficult. So when I spoke to these lecturers, what they said to me was, when it comes to the final year, the students come behind the lecturers and asking for, lecture hours and all, then only they realize that they have to face for some interviews and they have to go for a job and all. Till then, they of course won't understand the value of English. And apart from that, the students, do not have access to resources and also less opportunities. And so kind of things are even when I did the observations. So this is what I observe as well.
Thank you. Shivani, next.
See, one thing, like I said, responding to the fact that when we say that English hegemony has to be resisted, like I said in the presentation also, one has to be very careful that it's not substituted by then other forms of hegemony. And that's why the need to be careful about the ideas of standardization and what do we consider academic language. Why is language of experience, in which I experience the world, in which I'm able to ask nuanced questions, not by itself academic enough. That's one thing. There are two things, what language does, when I interact with students, it is a lot of burden on them when they feel that they have to, to just navigate higher university space. If you expect a student, even if you're offering support by way of English support classes, the feeling is that attending these classes, going for these classes happens at the cost of perhaps engaging with ideas in other original texts, or maybe participating in the active life of university. So then for some students, what we are saying is that learning the language and the medium is more important a task for you in a university space than actually engaging with ideas. Here, I was introduced to Deleuze, to Vedyo, to many other philosophers by friends who've not done English medium schooling. But university was a space which didn't focus so much as to what kind of English they're writing. So they had space to engage with ideas. When I tell student, I'm fine, you write it in Hindi, I'll help you translate. But the fact is, writing it in Hindi and translating means doing twice as much as task on as assignment. So while others are actually looking and engaging with literature, this person is supposed to first write and then get it translated. And we also need to look at, how do we look at academia and what today counts as progress or advancement in academia. Publishing is important. Nobody denies that research and publishing is important. But a large publishing industry, journals that are recognized as important are also in English. So even if many of us, I've made a concerted effort to also be writing in Hindi. But if I need to think about my career, I will of course have to write much more in English than in Hindi for those points to be met. So there is a need to look at what kind of space, academia is, not that it was supposed to be anything else. I mean, we do understand education has been a tool for social cultural reproduction. There is also another imagination of education as something, where critical transformation is possible. And for that, I think I'll just stop here by saying that, equality and social justice are ideas which cannot ever be superseded by goals of pragmatism. Pragmatism can be a strategy. It can't be a human civilizational goal. So I think if we can approach from that end, that it's ultimately equality, democratization, and justice that we are talking about, we'll find ways. There's a lot of good translation happening. Some private universities are engaging with good translation, where the process of vetting ensures that the language that is used for translation is more communicative than standardized. There are initiatives. One, of course, needs to expand them and participate more than think of pragmatics as a reason to not think of initiatives or engage in them. Yeah, that's.
Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was taking a few notes about the question of Hindi. I think very quickly Hindi is accessed, the two ways that Hindi is accessed by the participants in the study, and I think that could be extended to most schools in Ladakh, is, everybody learns it as a subject in school, but more importantly, it is acquired extramurally, which in applied linguistics really just means acquired everywhere else outside of the classroom. So television and the internet. And yes, there is a very complex sort of nature to Hindi in the linguistic repertoire of the participants of the study, right? The output is also extremely translingual. There are many textures of Hindi. A lot of the Hindi that is spoken is pidginized. There are many borrowings from Ladakhi. There are many borrowings from English. Everyone's texting their non-Ladakhi friends in Roman. So there are these, various textures of Hindi really. But also very importantly, Hindi is a compass to access the nation. And I think, Abhishek, that's what you were trying to sort of figure out. Is Hindi the language of the outsider? Yes. So when Chostar says Gyagarpa, which really just means people from the plains, Hindi is the language of the people from the plains, right? So it is the language of the outsider, but it is also a language that allows them to access the nation in the border areas and also to remain in it. So I would think that Hindi therefore brokers the sort of integration with the Indian state. It is a tool for governmentality, of course. One of the notes that I wrote down here was that as early as 1949, Jawaharlal Nehru, the first prime minister, had reportedly said to the Ladakhis from a podium, "You are backward in Ladakh and you must learn and train yourself to run the affairs of the country better." And Hindi had to be a way to sort of learn, how to self-govern. So Hindi is projected as the language of India, and because Ladakh is polemically part of India. So there are these extremely, strange textures of Hindi in the linguistic repertoire of these students, but there is also a very deep sort of cultural affect towards Hindi also as a language of Bollywood, music, and But I think it's the first language that you have access to when you step out of lay.
If I could just take one short minute, when I speak of multilingual education, the idea is multilingual education for all. As many of us in academia who are teaching are not multilingual, and that's a huge problem. So the burden of to be multilingual is often on those who are at the most distance from the languages of privilege. A lot of our difficulties of navigating multilingual classrooms would ease off if teachers in school and higher education made an attempt to know more languages. It's also their lack of ease in other languages which makes academics such a cocooned ivory tower kind of a space.
Absolutely. I think most teachers in higher education would be frightened at the prospect of having to teach in more than one language. So I think that's what's keeping things the way they are. I think we have one question. All right.
Thank you so much to all the presenters. That was absolutely amazing, and such an informative and deeply interesting topics. My question is of two parts. The first one is to Dr. Anwar, and the second one is kind of, I want both Dr. Anwar and Dr. Nag to comment on this. So the first part of the question is, I actually very deeply appreciate your recognition of the whole irony of Bangladesh's kind of being the country of who fought for language, and then kind of also doing sort of a similar thing with the controversial Chittagong Hill Track situation that is happening with the indigenous communities. And when we're thinking about these problems, I remember during my time in Bangladesh, I would constantly think about how is it that we can solve these, because the problem becomes really twofold. If we kind of encourage the indigenous communities to learn in their own language, when they reach a certain point, they become limited in their access to other things, right? So this poses a problem for them to become kind of grow further, maybe like access like better paying jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I can kind of have been noticing. Even when I went to the tea gardens in Sri Mangal, people there, the tribal people there, they speak excellent English. Yet when we were conversing, they kind of say that, we are burdened by this. We learn our language, have to learn Bengali, and then we have to learn English as well. And all the pressure, it comes onto these things, onto these people. And so my kind of the thought process that I have is that, how do we go about it? Because the pressure, we still end up pressuring the people who have been marginalized all along. The second part of my question is kind of like about, again, this whole issue of access and I guess decolonizing global knowledge. I would really want to think that when we're, again, kind of stemming from my first question, when we're thinking about involving more of these languages in, that this is very, very important, because language is, as you all have mentioned, a tool for identity and cultural element. So when I was talking to some of my peers in Bangladesh, and I would notice, and I do some short studies, I realized that people who come from English medium background schools, they're more westernized, as we would put it. And they kind of are very out of tune with their traditions and their culture. And they're kind of like, oh, that's so outdated, etc. That is not something that we would want to promote. Yet this is something that's happening as they're kind of switching, taking IGCSEs instead of like local exams, and this trend is kind of happening. The way that I was thinking about it, and this has been a kind of like a very thing that I've been thinking about a lot, is that what if we encourage people from the global north to kind of move their knowledge creation with these communities, with these indigenous people, What if we move people from like who are already professors or complete their PhD in Oxford and USA, etc., to go to these communities and then kind of work with that? Because if we kind of put the entire pressure on these indigenous communities, they will, the inequality will still be there, because here in the UK, people have the privilege of just having one language. Yet, you know, for these communities, they have to learn 3 languages. And yeah, so I hope that.
Sure.
Yeah, we're just a little pressed for time. So Anwar and Shivani, if you could quickly respond to the question.
Sure. Thank you so much for this thought-provoking question. Actually, this is very important. I think this is something I also alluded to in my paper, that the logic of multilingualism that we have is very market-driven, like open market, right? So people have the choice, the agency, but they don't really. So I totally agree with you that the parents in indigenous communities, they don't want to have indigenous language, their first language, as the medium of instruction in school. And this is what we find from various studies. One study that I cited in my paper by Sultana et al. Like even the indigenous teachers don't want their first language in their school. They said, like clearly, they said they want English and Bengali because of the economic pressure on them. So, and that's precisely because of this reason, I want government intervention. I want support from the people in power. So we should not just hold the indigenous people in rural communities responsible for this, their inability to choose to educate their children in their first language, because they need job, right? They need economic security, they need English. So in the current like system, like economic and education, we cannot blame them if they want to learn English, if they want to send their kids to the Western universities. So I think, and that's why we need the support from the government, and we need a different kind of multilingualism.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just one line, instead of asking people from Google not to go there, I would and become authors of somebody else's experience. Let people write, they can help translate in whichever language. So let them not co-opt experiences and let marginalized always remain objects of study. Let marginalized write their own theories and histories, and yeah, Global North can happily translate. Thank you.
And I think we find an excellent example in knowledge production among the Zapatistas, which I think is another way of imagining how, you know, we talk about participatory research, but what is truly participatory. So I think that's another way to look at it. I'm so sorry that we're completely out of time for other questions, but we will break for lunch. So if you have further questions, at least the panelists here would be happy to answer them. Right, and thank you.
Very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Panel. So thank you very much to Abhishek and to all the panelists. We'll be breaking for lunch now. We have a lunch available downstairs in the same place where we had tea, and we will be back 2:20. Maybe they'll give us like 40 minutes for lunch break, and we will now be stopping the live streaming on YouTube, and for the online presenters will be back 2:20 for the session on cast. So thank you very much, and we can continue these conversations during lunch while we are here in seminar room 1 downstairs. Thank you.